When I was 9 years old, I met a high school chemistry teacher, Mr. White, who had been diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. He wasn't making enough money on his salary to cover the cost of the cancer treatment, so he had to turn to meth to pay for his hospital bills. Now, Mr. White isn't a teacher at FHS. Actually, he's a character on the show Breaking Bad. And even though he isn't real, he does teach me something important about the American health system, which is that in America, we had a popular TV show about a man who has to turn to sell industrial quantities of meth to pay for his hospital bills. Even though the show is fictional, it does reflect actual statistics about healthcare spending in the U.S. This is a real graph, and as you can see, the U.S. stands alone from other developed countries in terms of healthcare spending. So while we spend a lot more on healthcare spending than other more developed countries, we have around the same life expectancy. My name is Parker Spradley, and my topic for ISM is pulmonary and critical care medicine. I'm a junior, and I'm involved on our cross-country National Honor Society Student Council, our Honor Society, BPA, and HOSA clubs and teams here at Frisco High School. On the weekends, I work at Katy College Prep Frisco, which is an SAT and ACT prep place. And then that's a picture of me at the HOSA National Leadership Conference from last year. So my reason for wanting to do ISM is simple. I'm interested in the medical field, and I would like to learn more about it. Ever since I was in 8th grade, I've taken every opportunity that I've gotten the opportunity to have to experience science. When I was a freshman in high school, I attended Sam Ryan's Genetics Conference. I participated in State Science Fair in 8th grade, and I've competed in medical terminology and medical office procedures at the state and national levels. By the time I've graduated, I will have taken all 6 AP Science classes offered here at Frisco High School, but what I have not had the opportunity to do yet is shadow a physician. So that's what I was hoping to do in ISM, so that I could learn kind of what sort of future I can have with this knowledge of science. My quote for ISM is "Be the change that you want to see in the world" by Mahatma Gandhi. And if I could have one ability, it would be the ability to save a life, because that's the kind of change that I want to make. So to be more specific on my topic, pulmonology is a physician working in a specialty of internal medicine that deals with the diagnostics and treatment of lung disease. And pulmonologists, they don't only work in critical care medicine, they can also work in outpatient or inpatient care. But they're the most widely represented specialty in intensive care medicine because they are able to operate the mechanical ventilators that most patients need to breathe in the ICU. So I'm going to tell you guys about the interviews in the order that I conducted them. My first interview was Dr. Terada, and he is the Professor Chief of Internal Medicine and Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine at UT Southwestern Medical School. And he's not really a clinical care doctor, and he doesn't really work in the ICU. Since he's more experienced, he's kind of gravitated more towards doing research pertaining to cellular and molecular biology. And then my second interview was Dr. Chen. She is a pulmonologist who works in the ICU at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. And her favorite thing about working at Parkland is the diverse and underserved population that she sees among the patients, which is definitely true because Parkland Hospital provides the most undercompensated patient care of any hospital in Dallas. My third interview was Dr. Chandran, and he's actually a general practitioner rather than a pulmonologist. And I wanted to interview somebody working in internal medicine because to become a pulmonologist, you first have to become certified in internal medicine. And he does not recommend becoming a primary care physician. He recommends pursuing a fellowship and becoming more specialized, like getting a specialty in cardiology or pulmonology, and that is because he believes that primary care physicians are undercompensated for the amount of work that they do. My fourth interview was Dr. Laveno, who is the director of the Medical Intensive Care Unit at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, and that interview was really important because it introduced me to the problem of ICU delirium, which I decided to investigate for my original work. And then my fifth interview was Dr. Finklia. He works in the clinical unit at UT Southwestern. And then he was actually inspired to pursue medicine from his own experiences in the ICU. After I conducted these 5 interviews, I hadn't yet found somebody who would be willing to be my mentor. So I conducted a 6th interview. It was a contact that Dr. Leveno had recommended to me, and that was Dr. Prince. And she is the head pulmonologist at Baylor Scott & White in Temple. And I had originally not expected for her to be my mentor because she lives so far away. But after she offered to help me with her original work and I shadowed her over break, I decided that I did want to ask her to be my mentor. So for my research assessments, the first assessment that I did, it kind of ties into my introduction. It was about the healthcare crisis in the US. And it's basically how a lot of people are being declined healthcare and how healthcare is so expensive. And they attribute this to the privatization of the healthcare industry and how it's government controlled. And then they talk about how it's more effective in Canada because they have a single payer healthcare system. And the reason I wanted to investigate kind of some of the more negative aspects of the medical field is because I already know that I want to go into it, and I wanted to know if there was maybe any reason that I wouldn't want to go into it. And so my second research assessment, it was research that Dr. Terada had done. I wanted to do an assessment over some of his research so I could talk about it in the interview. And that was about the effects of nitric oxide on secondary lung injury. The third research assessment that I did was called Tell People What It's Really Like to Be a Doctor. And it was from the standpoint of a physician who said that many physicians do not recommend going into the medical field. And then he talked about how it's not what people expect it to be like. Doctors do a lot more paperwork and they handle a lot more patient finances than most people expect. My fourth research assessment was over the UNT field trip that we took to ISM and just the biology lecture that we had there and that I observed there. And then I did a research assessment over e-cigarette usage. It basically was talking about how trends in e-cigarette usage among middle school and high school students has tripled in the last year. Well, it was actually from 2014 to 2015 because that was when they didn't have any laws regulating e-cigarette usage, but now they do. And then my final research assessment was I did it after Dr. Leveno's interview because I wanted to do some research on delirium. I was considering doing it for my original work. So that was called ICU Delirium and Update. And it basically summarized all the current information, and it was kind of a review of literature on everything that people know about delirium right now. So after I did this research assessment about the ICU Delirium Update, I have a subscription to the magazine The Atlantic, and I actually saw an article in The Atlantic about ICU delirium, and it had a very interesting introduction. It's talking about this patient named B. Paul Turpin, and I'll describe you his experience. It says, when B. Paul Turpin was admitted to a Tennessee hospital in January, his doctor's only concern was his survival. But as he battled a life-threatening infection, Turpin developed terrifying hallucinations, including one in which he was performing on a stage soaked with blood. Doctors tried to quell his delusions with increasingly large doses of sedatives, but this only made him more disoriented. So nearly 5 months later, Turpin's infection had been routed, but his life was upended by ICU delirium. So my original work was kind of investigating how the environment of the ICU contributes to it, and then kind of coming up with some suggestions for changing the environment to reduce the prevalence of ICU delirium. And this is my research pathway for my original work. The first thing in the sequence was, like I talked about, the research assessment about the update on ICU delirium. Then I used that to write my original work proposal. And then after that, I kind of wanted to learn more about exactly what delirium means. So I went into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and I looked at the delirium definition and diagnostic criteria. And then after that, I conducted some research to create an evaluation of the impact of delirium in the ICU, and I interviewed patients about their ICU experience. I also wrote a paper about the ICU and the intensive care unit in general, and basically like its faculty structure and costs. And then after that, I wrote the ICU environment and associated problems, and then wrote some suggestions for improving the ICU environment. So the objective of my original work was to evaluate how ICU environment is conducive to the development of delirium and explore potential ways to augment the ICU environment to reduce the onset of delirium. And my methods for doing this study were conducting more intensive research, observing the environment of different hospitals and ICUs, and talking to patients who had previously undergone extensive hospital stays. So what is delirium? Delirium is defined as a disturbance in consciousness accompanied by a change in cognition. And then this includes a reduced awareness of the environment. So if you're asking patients questions, they might not be paying attention to you, might be thinking about something else. A change in cognition, which is memory impairment, disorientation, or language disturbance. So you might ask somebody what day it is, and they have no idea. And then a change in perception, which is misinterpretations, illusions, or hallucinations. And hallucinations are very common in the intensive care unit. So another characteristic of delirium, as opposed to dementia, is that it develops over a very short period of time. So in the ICU, and it did not exist. It was not a pre-existing condition before the patient was admitted to the hospital. And it also fluctuates during the course of the day, which it makes it kind of hard to diagnose, because in the morning a patient could seem completely lucid, and then in the afternoon they might be delirious. So delirium in the ICU is very prevalent. Almost 80% of mechanically ventilated patients develop delirium in the ICU. And then the mortality rate for patients who suffer from ICU delirium is slightly higher than the normal, and it's 34%. And 10 is the average number of additional days that delirious patients spend in the hospital. So this shows that delirium in the ICU is correlated with both extended hospital stay and increased mortality rates. So when I interviewed patients, I didn't actually interview patients who were currently in the hospital and suffering from delirium, because those interviews, first of all, you would have to get ICU patient consent, and it probably wouldn't be a very informative interview because they would be confused. So I interviewed people that I actually know, who I know have had to go through, who have had extensive hospital stays in the past. And the first person I interviewed was a 42-year-old woman. She was hospitalized for 1 month in the ICU with pneumonia, multiple organ failure, and acute respiratory distress syndrome. And then a quote from that interview is that, unlike ordinary nightmares and more like paranoid delusions, the hallucinations tended to occur in real time and to hook onto slices of external reality. So I also asked her about some of her experiences in the ICU, and she said that some things that she did was invent conspiracy theories about the physicians and nurses, and then she also would sometimes attempt to escape the hospital by ripping out her ventilation tube. I also interviewed a 53-year-old woman who was hospitalized for 10 days in the ICU after undergoing surgery for congestive heart failure. And then her quote is, it was really sad. It was that near-death hallucinations are terrible. She says that, you know how some people in hospitals, when they're dying, they say that they see a light? And she said that she saw statues telling her that she was ready to die. And she does not consider herself lucky that she survived her ICU experience. She says that if she had to be in the ICU again, she'd probably just want to die because it was that horrible. And her experiences are that she described staring at the TV screen when it was not turned on and saying that she was watching a very good movie when there was nothing on, and then she could not recall her location. The third interview that I'm going to tell you guys about is a 67-year-old man. He was hospitalized for nearly a month with sepsis, ARDS, and encephalopathy, and they never determined the cause. But he was able to recover physically from his ailments, but once he was discharged, he didn't ever regain his mental state that he had before he was in the ICU. And then his experiences, he was really disoriented. He would repeatedly ask people what their worst fear was, and he even imagines that when he was in the ICU, he was in the process of turning into a butterfly. So about the intensive care unit, ICU care is for patients who are in critical condition and need life-sustaining treatment. The ICU is the most costly unit of hospitals, with daily costs averaging around $4,000 a day. And mortality rates are also the highest, and they're up to 30%. And then the average ICU stay is around 10 days, so it can get really expensive really quickly. These are problems that are associated with the ICU environment, and most of them have to do with disturbances in a patient's sleep-wake cycle, because that's what's responsible for delirium. The first one and the biggest problem is probably noise, and patients find it difficult to get sleep because of the continuous background noise from all the machines in the ICU. And then ICU patients in general spend 30 to 40% of their sleep time awake. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, but when you're sleeping, there are two sleep cycles. One is like rapid eye movement, and that's deep sleep, and then they're always usually in kind of the non-REM or non-rapid eye movement sleep, which is considered to be awake. Light and temperature is another problem, and even though the lights in the ICU are timed to reflect a normal 24-hour circadian rhythm, there can be lights from the nursing station or again lights from machines that are turned on, which can also be very disruptive to patient sleep. And then another problem with ICU patients is restricted communication. So the limitation in communication, eating, and movement that's kind of brought on by having an endotracheal tube all add to the stress experienced by the ICU patients because they feel like they can't communicate with people. So taking into account this information, and I made some suggestions for improving the environment in the ICU, and they're mostly geared towards reducing the amount of noise. So the first one is implementing soffits and baffles in the ceilings to help reduce echoed sounds. The second one is to include natural lighting in the ICU when possible to help get that natural circadian rhythm. And then incorporating a clock or calendar to improve patient sensory orientation so they're always aware of their date and location. And then soundproofing individual rooms, double glazing windows, and constructing walls with materials of high sound absorbing capabilities will all help contribute to reducing the amount of noise in the ICU. So my mentor I've mentioned is Dr. Whitney Prince. She is a pulmonologist at Baylor Scott & White Healthcare in Temple. And then she is board certified in pulmonary medicine, critical care medicine, and internal medicine. So her education, she went to University of Texas School in Houston, and then she also did her fellowship in pulmonary and critical care at Baylor Medical School in Houston. So my first mentor visit, it lasted kind of longer than I had expected it to. I had planned to leave at 5 a.m. because she lives, Temple's about 2 hours away, so I had planned to leave at 5 a.m. and get there at 8 and then shadow her for 4 hours in return. But I ended up observing a CABG, or coronary artery bypass surgery, that it would have been 6 hours, but I only observed 2 hours of it. So then it ended up taking longer than I expected, but I really liked it because I had a really full mentor visit, and it really taught me a lot of things. So the first thing that I did was observe Dr. Prince in the ICU when she was taking care of her ECMO patients. And then this is a new acronym that I learned. It stands for extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. And she described it as being kind of dialysis for the lungs. So it basically filters out all the blood and then oxygenates it and then returns it so that the lungs and heart don't have to do as much work. And then I also watched her recording patients' vital signs and taking patients' medical history. That was a big part of her work in the ICU. And then after that, I observed a patient who was having balloon angioplasty in the cath lab in an attempt to bypass a clog in their heart. But the balloon angioplasty failed because the balloon couldn't move through the blockage. So then they had to prep the patient for an emergency CABG surgery, which I mentioned stands for coronary artery bypass. And so I observed the first 2 hours of that surgery. I watched them make the incision into the chest and then tear it apart. So for my future plans, I want to go to college somewhere in Texas. I think our in-state schools are a really good deal, and I like the environment of Texas, so I'm looking at UT Austin or Texas A&M. And then I want to earn as many AP credits as possible so I can pursue more interests in college. And then I am considering a double major in biology and English, and if I don't double major, I plan to minor in Spanish. So I've definitely learned a lot through ISM so far. Thanks for listening to my presentation.